Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone, for coming in despite the weather. I'm Robin Green. I'm a senior policy counsel at New America's Open Technology Institute, and I just wanted to briefly welcome you to OTI and the ACLU of DC's event, Turning the Tide on Police Surveillance, How Cities Are Finally Starting to Rein in Cops and the Proliferation of Spy Tech. For almost 2 decades, state and local law enforcement departments have stocked up on invasive surveillance technology for monitoring their communities, and they've done so without the knowledge of their residents and without any meaningful oversight by their local governments. From street cameras to stingrays, law enforcement has amassed unprecedented capabilities to track where we go, what we do, and with whom we communicate. However, we have finally reached the beginning of the end. State and local governments across the country, from Somerville, Massachusetts to Nashville, Tennessee, and all over the West Coast, have been passing ordinances that would require transparency and accountability when police acquire these surveillance technologies. These ordinances have largely been modeled after the draft bill created by the Community Control Over Police Surveillance Coalition, otherwise known as CCOPS, which the ACLU leads and of which OTI is a member. Indeed, just last week, Palo Alto, California, and San Francisco's Public Transit Authority, BART, adopted CCOPS laws, and our hope is that the District of Columbia will be next. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Chad Marlowe to the stage for a presentation on the surveillance technologies that are most commonly in use in these communities and how we can rein them in. Chad is the ACLU's Senior Advocacy and Policy Counsel. Chad, take it away.
Thank you. Is there a way I can take this Smurf? Oh, there it goes. Just very heavy. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chad Marlowe, and I'm an Advocacy and Policy Counsel with the ACLU, and it is extremely nice to be with all of you this afternoon as we prepare to kick off our push to bring a community control over police surveillance, or CCOPS, effort to our nation's capital. I'm going to focus my comments this afternoon on 2 things. First of all, I'm going to talk about some of the types of surveillance technologies that are being commonly used by police departments in 2018. And then I'm also going to touch upon some of the key foundations of the nationwide CCOPS effort. Now, at the outset, let me just say that surveillance technologies may have positive benefits. I am not here to argue otherwise. But as our discussion of these technologies will highlight, their use also carries risks, some of which can severely threaten the public's civil rights and civil liberties, including their right to privacy and their freedom of speech. It is also very important to note that while surveillance technologies carry a risk of adverse impacts to all of us, not every person and group is threatened the same by surveillance technologies. And this is the case because both historically and currently, surveillance has been disproportionately targeted at communities of color, at low-income communities, at other vulnerable groups like Muslims and immigrants, and at persons who are politically active. All of this is to say that when we as a society are contemplating the deployment of a surveillance technology, we need to fully open our eyes to the technology's benefits and its drawbacks. Most critically, we need to weigh these pluses and minuses against each other to determine what limits should be placed on the surveillance technology's use, or if its use should be prohibited altogether. Let me make 2 quick points before going into my discussion of these surveillance technologies. The first is that I am not crazy, although it occurred to me when I wrote that most crazy people would tell you they're not crazy. So perhaps it's better to say that this is not a talk in science fiction. I'm not going to put on a tinfoil hat and tell you that this is the best means to prevent the FBI from reading your thoughts. Bear in mind that all the technologies I'm discussing right now are real and they are being used right now. Second, decisions about acquiring and using these surveillance technologies, including here in DC, are almost always made unilaterally and in secret by the police. as you hear me talk about these technologies, please think about how comfortable you are with that being the status quo. All right, let's get into some of these technologies. The first technology I wanted to talk about today are stingrays. Now, they also go by some different names. That's a brand name. A more modern version of it's called the Hailstorm. But essentially what they are is fake cell phone towers. And the way that they operate really is kind of like the children's game of Marco Polo. When a stingray shouts out Marco, your cell phone has no choice but to shout out Polo. And in shouting out Polo, it does a couple of things to what it thinks is a legitimate cell phone tower it's trying to connect up to. One, it tells the cell phone tower, in this case the stingray, who you are and where you are. Another thing it does is it enables the stingray device to intercept written content being generated by your phone while it's connected. So that could mean text messages or emails. There is also the capability, although we don't know in this case whether this is actually being used right now, of using this connection to implant spyware on your phone. And so that would enable whoever is tracking you using the stingray to continue to track you or potentially to continue to intercept your messages once you have moved out of the location of the stingray device. So obviously you can see how the use of a stingray has pretty strong privacy and free speech implications. Another thing to bear in mind with stingrays is they are a consummate mass surveillance device. They cannot be targeted. So if the police are using a stingray because they want to try to identify the location of a particular phone, they cannot train the stingray on a particular phone. What a stingray does is it sweeps up every cell phone within its radius. That can be dozens, hundreds, or even thousands of cell phones, depending on where it's being used. Now, the problem with this, it's probably the easiest to illustrate using an example of, let's say, a Black Lives Matter leader. And I choose Black Lives Matter very consciously because I think they are probably the largest, most inappropriately surveilled group in the country, certainly in the last 5 years. So imagine you have a police force who is interested in identifying the location of a Black Lives Matter leader. They have that person's cell phone, and so they activate a stingray, and they identify that that person is within the location, but they also, of course, identify every other person that's within that location. If they do that on that leader, say, a dozen times, that gives them the ability to figure out not only where that leader has been, but everyone else who's coming up regularly in the same area as that person. And now you have generated a list of contacts and associates and perhaps other leaders of the movement. So it's in that sort of way that the mass surveillance capabilities of the stingray can be also problematic for the right of association. The next technology I want to talk about are called automatic license plate readers. We often abbreviate it just as ALPRs. They essentially are fairly easy. They're cameras that have the capability of photographing a license plate and then digitizing its number and state so it can be run against databases. These can either be planted on the ground at select locations or they can actually be mobile. You may have actually seen them. They're kind of oblong-looking black things like this on the back of a police car where they're commonly deployed. Now, ALPRs can have good uses. And again, this is a case with some surveillance technologies I'm going to talk about. For example, for toll collection, if you put out ALPRs, people don't have to be reliant on E-ZPass. They're able to kind of whip through tolls and pay. You don't have the environmental problems and the traffic problems. And so they can potentially be something like that. They can also be good for, say, Amber Alerts. You know, you have a situation where you have a kidnapped child in a car and you're trying to see if you can locate that car. So they can be potentially good for that. They can also be very, very bad. ALPRs can be used, especially if they're deployed greatly throughout a community or a city, to track everywhere you drive in your car. That means they know what doctor's offices you visit, what religious institutions you go to, what political meetings you attend. They also can figure out where you're sleeping at night. And you know, imagine, if you will, that a police department, say here in DC, and again, hypothetical, not actual, there's a member of the council who doesn't really vote the way they want on police matters, but they figured out that this person doesn't necessarily sleep every night at their home. You know, pressure can be brought to bear when you're able to collect data like this. Another problem that these are starting to pop up as a problem is that private companies are approaching police forces and offering to give them all the ALPRs they want for free. What they get in return is access to the data, and what they use it, and Vigilant is a company that does this. I think they first tried to roll it out in Austin, didn't get much of a reception there, but they say, send us the data, and we're going to find people who have outstanding fines and fees that they've not paid. And let's be very clear, these are almost always poor people who have not paid their fines and fees. They then alert the police car, who pulls them over and says, you either pay your fine or fee right now with a debit card or I'm taking you to jail. And by the way, there's a $30 processing fee that gets tacked on that goes to this private company who provided the readers, and that's how they make the money off of it. So, we get in a situation where this technology is now used to target low-income people with threats of jail in order to make more money for for-profit companies. There are other risks of using ALPRs. Two examples from California. In Oakland, recently, about 6 to 9 months ago, it was discovered. Oakland is a sanctuary city, right? So sanctuary city means that we are not going to use our city's apparatus to go after undocumented persons in our city. But Oakland uses ALPRs, and they share them with fusion centers, and they share them with private companies, and guess what happened? In that sharing, ICE also had access to that shared data and then used it to identify undocumented persons in Oakland. So despite being a sanctuary city, their lack of thoughtfulness and oversight into their own data put them at risk here. By the way, Oakland has since adopted a CCOPS law. Another situation is in Sacramento County, California, where I literally just learned last week. They're using their ALPRs to identify welfare recipients and to track them to see if they might come across any evidence of welfare fraud. Again, not necessarily any proof that the person is engaged in fraud and then investigating it, but just to generally track people they might be suspicious of. Is there a solution, though, to being able to balance good uses and bad uses? Yeah, there is. You put in strict use and data retention and sharing limitations, but these don't happen automatically. These are the sort of things you need a CCOPS law in order to ensure are in place. The next one that you'll probably be greatly familiar with are closed-circuit television cameras or surveillance cameras. Now, when you talk about this surveillance technology, it's helpful to divide them into two categories, which is to say private cameras and public cameras. Private cameras, generally speaking, do not present much of a privacy risk. And the reason for that is because they are controlled by an individual entity who's using them, be it your corner bodega or your bank with an ATM. And so that information rests in the control of a private entity. And although the police can get it if they're doing an investigation, there's a process by which they would have to request it or get a warrant. And so access to it is individualized and slow. And so that makes private cameras safer. But giant linked networks of cameras can present a real risk to privacy and other rights. And this is so whether or not that network is owned by a government or whether it's simply accessible at will to the government. And this latter category I want to highlight because governments are more and more seeking the permission of private surveillance camera owners to be able to access what they're doing. And they're actually doing a little bit of a weird carrot and a stick thing, and I want to highlight what's happening in Detroit, Michigan, where they have something called Project Greenlight. Now, what Project Greenlight is an attempt to get police permission to have full-time and real-time access to private surveillance cameras, and they're starting with gas stations. The weird thing is what they are offering the gas stations in return for access is more frequent police patrols of their property and kind of tier 1 access to police officials to discuss their concerns about public safety. Now, you would think this would be something that would be extended to all residents of Detroit, not just to those people who are willing to share surveillance technology with the police, but this is Project Greenlight in Detroit, and it was most certainly not approved by any elected officials in advance of being rolled out. The next technology, and this often scares the bejesus out of people for good reason, are surveillance light bulbs. Now, what are surveillance light bulbs? They're essentially energy-efficient LED light bulbs with built-in cameras and microphones. They have a wonderful sales pitch, right? They get to go to the city and they get to say, hey, you're using those really inefficient, bad environmental, break all the time, incandescent light bulbs in your street lamps. Wouldn't it be great if you replace them with these energy-efficient LEDs? Save money, save the environment. Oh, and by the way, did we mention that they have built-in cameras and microphones? You can either pay a little bit more for the ability to add them later when you want, or a little bit more than that to have them in now. Wouldn't that be great? So imagine, if you will, if this had to be part of a public conversation, right? And instead of a city saying, hey, we're going to be installing energy-efficient light bulbs that just so happen to have surveillance capabilities, if they had to say to you instead, guess what we're going to do? We're installing surveillance devices in every street light in the entire city, because guess what? They're also light bulbs. You'd get a very different reaction. And I want the people here from Washington, D.C. and from any other city to imagine what your city would look like if every street light was transferred into a surveillance device with a camera and a microphone. That really feels like Big Brother at its core. And again, not hypothetical. We don't know everywhere these light bulbs have been purchased. I know for a fact they've been purchased by Providence, Rhode Island. I know for a fact that they are active at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey. So again, this is not hypothetical. Next category, and it's kind of a bucket, is biometric technologies. So this is your facial recognition, gait recognition, voice recognition, iris recognition. With this technology, the police and the government no longer need your ID or your fingerprint to be able to identify who you are. They can use other characteristics that are very difficult to conceal. If you will imagine adding facial recognition to surveillance cameras or surveillance light bulbs, and now you have the government and the police with the Orwellian ability to track everyone as they move about in public. In addition to massive privacy concerns, there are also substantial civil rights concerns around facial recognition technology, because the technology is not good at identifying the faces of persons of color. What this means is you tend to get a lot of false positives, which then will produce an increase in the danger of police interactions. And I think we are all acutely aware of the danger that comes from interactions between the police and persons of color in every city in this country. And we certainly don't want to do anything that creates false and an increased number of interactions. As a matter of fact, a recent test on facial recognition software that was done by the ACLU actually found quite a number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus. They ran facial recognition against their faces, and they came up on criminal databases. So we have a sense of that. Now, is this something that's going to be made available rapidly? You're darn right it is. Guess who's selling it? Amazon. And they're calling it recognition with a K because they're witty like that. And it's very, very cheap, and they're rolling it out to police. They bought it in Orlando, Florida, but there's since been a massive pushback against that. The next one I want to talk about is social media monitoring software. Now, this software enables the police or other government entities to scan public content on websites like Twitter, as well as Facebook or Instagram pages that have public security settings. To be honest, although we're trying to learn it, I'm not really certain the extent to which these software have the ability to penetrate private accounts. There have been some indications that they are able to at times, but again, with surveillance, they're not exactly telling us how it works and putting it right in front of us. So the question is, what are they looking for, right, if they're scanning social media? Well, let me tell you one thing they're looking for. Again, I kind of tipped it off before, but in Oakland, New York City, Memphis, Tennessee, they're looking for Black Lives Matter. They're searching for the hashtag Black Lives Matter, anyone talking about it, talking about events, and asking to be pinged when anyone mentions that on their social media. And obviously, that's not limited to Black Lives Matter. That can be done for any political perspective or any gathering across the entire field. Students are also being increasingly targeted, with the claim of an effort to mostly, I guess, prevent mass shootings, I guess in lieu of other more direct and obvious approaches that would be less violative of First and Fourth Amendment rights, but there it is. And so what happens here? What happens to political activists? What happens to students when the most important free speech platform of the 21st century is being threatened because people are monitoring it all the time? The answer is they know there's no privacy guarantees on there, and so they stop using it. And when they stop using it, we're really kind of clamping down on their free speech. The last one that I just wanted to mention today, because I referred to it earlier, are fusion centers. Fusion centers are essentially places where state and local government, police, and law enforcement entities flood in all their surveillance data so they can share it amongst themselves and amongst other agencies. Obviously, police data sharing is important, but when it's done in secret and no one can comment upon what restrictions are or not in place and whether or not the sharing is consistent with existing public policies, you can run into a lot of trouble. They did in Oakland, and I'm sure that in any other place, Oakland is not kind of an exception in and of itself. So, these technologies, again, I'm afraid are just the tip of the iceberg. There are other ones that I do not have time to go in today, but I wanted to just ping them for you because you should be concerned about them and research them on your own if you will. Predictive policing software, police body cameras, drones, gunshot detection technologies like ShotSpotter, X-ray vans, through-the-wall sensor technology. Yes, that's a thing. So again, it's a large field, and right now decisions about whether it's used or not are really not necessarily known to you or even your representatives in government. All right, so let's kind of get down to brass tacks now. Does the ACLU think the benefits of using these technologies outweigh their drawbacks? So respectfully, that's the wrong question. We have an opinion and we'd like it to be heard, but ours is not the only opinion on the subject, and it's certainly not the most important opinion when it comes to local decision making. Do the police think the benefits of using these technologies outweigh their drawbacks? Well, that's the current question being asked, and often the only question being asked. And while their opinion may be valuable, it is also the wrong one to be principally focused on. Does the public, and especially members of the most impacted communities, think the benefits of using these surveillance technologies outweigh their drawbacks? That's the question you need to be asking. It is the question our elected officials should be focused on, and they should be fully empowered to act upon the opinions that they receive from their constituents. And that is what CCOPS is at its core. Yes, CCOPS is about surveillance technologies, but CCOPS is fundamentally a good government and transparency effort that moves the question about decisions about the acquisition and use of surveillance technologies out of the darkness and into the light by giving elected officials and not the police the final say over the use of these technologies. Now, contrary to what some opponents that we faced in law enforcement community might tell you, the NYPD ran to Morning Joe to scream about this, CCOPS do not require the disclosure of state-level secrets that could compromise public safety. Rather, it provides the public with enough foundational information to enable them to engage in a well-informed debate about whether these technologies should be used, and if so, what limits should be placed on their use. CCOP laws also require that technology-specific use policies be drafted and approved as part of the technology's approval process so that where technology approvals are granted, they come with legally enforceable limitations on their use and their data sharing, and also include provisions like auditing and oversight requirements and protections against civil rights and civil liberties abuses. Ultimately, CCOPS empowers elected officials to decide in an open public forum if the deployment of a proposed surveillance technology would produce a net benefit or harm to their constituents. And with 9 jurisdictions having already adopted CCOPS laws, including 2 in the last week, we are at a point where localities should no longer be asking if they need to adopt a CCOPS law, but rather should be asking why they don't already have one. Right, Washington, D.C.? Now, there's just 2 quick things I want to touch on before I wrap up. The first is anyone in the audience, anyone watching on live stream, anywhere in the country, the ACLU and our partners have put all of the information about CCOPS, model bills, guiding principles, descriptions of the technology, deeper discussions on a public website, which is communitycontrol.com. Only control is spelled like on your keyboard, CTRL, so communityctrl.com. We've had quite a few movements around the country pop up by people in their individual communities, everywhere from St. Louis, places in Michigan, Yellow Springs, Ohio, pop up because people are interested. And the final thing I wanted to do, and I'm really having an opportunity to do this, is I wanted to just touch a moment on a role that one of my fellow panelists, Eugene Puryear, has played in this effort, and he does not know this. So I'm happy to, I always want to tell him in person, and it's a little bit weird, Eugene, but they'll just mind their own business why I say it. But when the ACLU was considering launching the CCOPS effort 2 years ago, our focus of this work was on community empowerment. We knew that this effort was driven largely by racial and social justice considerations. And you don't launch a program about community empowerment unless you know communities want you to do it. And so we had the good fortune of having an event held by the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law, which is represented by its executive director, Laura Moy, here today, called The Color of Surveillance. And it gave us an opportunity to go down and really hear diverse perspectives from the most impacted communities on whether this was a worthwhile effort. One of the panelists was Eugene, who gave an amazing talk about the proliferation of surveillance, particularly surveillance cameras in his neighborhood, what he was concerned about the implications and impacts of that might be. And so afterwards, I kind of cornered him in the hallway. And unbeknownst to him, in NASA, before they launch a rocket, they go around and they say, go or no go. Flight, go, and they say go or they say no go. If anyone says no go, it doesn't launch. Well, Eugene doesn't realize it until right now. You are a go or no go at the ACLU. And I explained to him the effort and what it would be, and I said to him, is this something that you would want in your community? Would this be helpful? Would you want the ACLU to do this? And he didn't say go, but he said yes. And so so the truth of the matter is that this entire movement, all the cities, everything it's doing is because this man, in his wisdom, said go. And so I'm so excited to be a part about bringing this effort to your hometown of Washington, D.C. Thank you for coming, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Start talking to more people in hallways now.
Yeah.
I really, like 3 different people. I won't sit on the end.
We've got our names. Here you are, Chad. You're over here.
Okay.
They're small.
I'm glad they labeled it.
We passed the first test. So, good afternoon. My name is Brad Heath. I'm the Deputy Investigations Editor at USA Today. I've written about some of these issues, and I'm curious about them. And I have a lot of questions. But before I ask them, I mean, we want to just sort of go down the line and start with Laura. Tell us who you are, where you're coming from on this.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Laura Moy. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. It's a small think tank. We do research and writing on and advocacy on a range of privacy and surveillance issues. We focus on disproportionate impact on historically disadvantaged communities. So we host a big conference called Color of Surveillance that you heard a little bit about. I've done a bunch of work researching and writing about use of cell site simulators by Baltimore Police Department that I'll talk a little bit about today. We do a lot of research on face recognition technology. These are some of the issues, and there's a couple people in the audience here from the center. Anyway, very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Chad Marl, ACLU, and I stand by my previous remarks.
Eugene Puryear, I'm a community organizer here in Washington, D.C. I work, among other hats I wear, as a core organizer with the Stop Police Terror Project D.C., and obviously this is an issue that is very near and dear to our hearts because, as Chad was mentioning, I mean, certainly we feel targeted by a lot of these technologies, but I think also just as a citizen living in the District of Columbia where there is so much surveillance proliferating, sort of in a private capacity, also very concerned about that as well. Statehood now.
Hi, my name is Samina Usman. I'm the Government Relations Coordinator for the Council on American Islamic Relations, the San Francisco Bay Area office. What we do is that we provide free legal services to people who are experiencing any discrimination, hate crimes, school bullying, all based around Islamophobia. We also provide legal services to those who are targeted by the FBI. And we've been receiving a number of, an increase in cases of people who have been targeted by the FBI. Or have been, visited at their homes and offices for questioning. And then also now we're providing immigration services. And I've been actively involved with passing the surveillance ordinances in the Bay Area.
So we're here to talk about legislation, ordinances that would limit in some ways the power of the police to conduct surveillance. And I guess my first question is, why? I mean, it's easy to sort of be creeped out by the idea of a facial recognition camera, right? That's keeping track of everyone all the time. But what is the real harm from that?
So I can start a little bit with speaking on this question of face recognition specifically. As Chad mentioned in his very helpful opening remarks, many face recognition systems they're not designed to provide a no-match result in the event that they're applied out in the wild. They're designed to provide a likelihood that the person that you're looking at is someone that the system might have in its database. So in other words, if you submit a photo to a face recognition system for identification, in many instances, you're not going to get a result that says the confidence score that this photo matches any in our database is below a certain threshold. You'll just get a result that says essentially this photo, of all the photos in our database, this looks most like this one. So where there's bias built into the system, which is a prevalent problem as it relates to face recognition technology, many face recognition systems, or many studies of face recognition systems have consistently shown greater difficulty identifying faces of people of color than faces of white men in particular. Then you're looking at a higher rate of misidentification where you might be examining faces of color. And what that means is in the real world is that an armed officer might be looking at a person in front of them and be more likely to misidentify them as a person who is dangerous if they have dark skin because of the system that they're using.
One thing I think is an important point to make, though, is that the CCOPS effort is actually, in its first instance, not actually an effort to prevent the use of surveillance technologies. What it is in its first instance is it opens up the conversation about whether it should happen or not. So it's somewhat easy and strategic for persons who favor the broad use of surveillance to say, you should not have CCOPS, you should not have pushback because that's going to prevent us from keeping you safe. But in fact, all it says is involve the public, involve the elected officials. So, that's the first point. But in terms of why you push back in general, the founders of the country, I think in their wisdom, cared about protecting things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, privacy, and fear, be it of King George or of the current government, is stifling to those rights. And if you feel you are being watched, I've often heard it described for surveillance, and I think this is helpful. When you're driving down the highway in your car, and you look up in your rearview mirror, and there's a police car behind you, how do you feel all of a sudden, right? You make sure you hit your blinker right, you're driving the speed limit. That's what surveillance feels like. And so you really shrink into yourself when you feel like you're being watched, and I think that can really harm, whether you're talking about the ability to philosophically espouse for particular views, or whether you just want to walk to your corner store without facing the police rolling up on you and asking, why are you walking so slow or so fast? And so I think the implications are broad, and I think that when the only entity that has a role in that decision is only focused on law enforcement / crime limitation, you're not getting a really balanced decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo a lot of what's been said. I think the implications are very broad. I think first and foremost, we should be concerned about sort of a differential level of constitutional rights being established. You talk about things like persistent surveillance, to use a quick DC example. Some of you may have seen these. DC has these 360-degree mobile cameras that they set up in certain communities. I've seen it happen many times. They set them up at like a 4-way intersection so that basically you can see every single thing that's going on all day, every single day, down all 4 streets. So that means you can create a profile on every single person that lives there. I think we should be asking ourselves the questions about why there is, first of all, why they're doing it, but over and above that, why there's zero transparency, accountability, or really democratic control over a power where if you live in a certain neighborhood, your entire life is surveilled. If you live in another neighborhood, your life is never surveilled. I think that's highly problematic, but I think it also just speaks to the broader issue too of the role of the citizen in society and democracy as a concept. And it seems like there's like a weird inverse that the institutions that have the most power have the least accountability and the least transparency. And I think especially when it comes to the police, who have the ability to kill people, the ability to arrest you, to imprison you, to legally surveil you in all these different ways, that having even just the concept that you can have those sorts of things being not monitored, not controlled, and outside of, I think, the sphere of the average everyday person to say, wait a second, I don't like that. our government should not be doing this, and I'm speaking up, I think really raises as a question whether or not these are democratic institutions.
I think, as a member of the Muslim community, I think we're very concerned about surveillance, especially because surveillance has been overwhelmingly used against the Muslim community and, people of color, overwhelmingly. And it's, I think Chan, you had mentioned the case in New York, where the NYPD was spying on the Muslim community. And, they had their cameras that were focused on mosques and Muslim businesses and of Muslim leaders, tracking where people were going. Even I think it was so detailed as to what's on the menu of restaurants. How is that going to be solving or helping with combating terrorism? I know that hummus might be killer, but it's not. It's not going to prevent terrorism. So, and that actually did not, having that overwhelming spying of the Muslim community did not prevent anything, there's been no cases that have come out involving terrorism, and what it actually did was cause fear in the community and cause mistrust with law enforcement. And people, see this around the country. And Muslims have stopped going to mosques or speaking freely. It's definitely a chill on one's free speech. And so it's been very concerning for the American Muslim community. And I was involved with Santa Clara County when we were passing the ordinance over there. We had the Santa Clara County, they had quietly acquired a grant for Stingray technology of $500,000. This was done quietly, and when it came out in the open, that is where the community was very concerned. And so, and I guess we can probably go more into it later about that, but we also found in San Jose, which is part of Santa Clara County, they quietly acquired a drone as well. Without any public notice at all, and the community was outraged. And we said, no, we need to have a public process. We need to have this out in the, so that the community can weigh in on whether or not we want this type of technology, what type of rules and regulations are around there. We need transparency, and this is, I think, what really prompted getting these ordinances passed. And I guess we'll talk more about it later.
So I have a question about the transparency side of it, because on the one hand, it's very easy to understand the appeal of we all should get a say in directly what the government's doing. On the other hand, there's something to the argument, right, that the more detail we share about a police tool, the more easily circumvented it is. This had been the FBI's chapter and verse on things like stingrays for a long time, right? If criminals know we can track their phones, they'll turn off their phones and we won't be able to track the criminals. Is there something to that balance? How do you deal with that?
I think it's funny that people suggest that the CCOPS effort might tip off terrorists that we're trying to watch them. Because they have no idea that and also organized crime, they've never seen actually a crime movie and seen the government. Come on. So they know they're being watched. Almost all the technologies we're talking about, if you want to really find out about them, there's kind of a secret database, and I will share it with this room. It's called Google. Put in Stingray, put in ALPR, and you can find out everything you want to know. But even beyond that, within the CCOP, we do understand that. We don't want to give levels of detail where they can say, oh, if we do this with our phone, then the Stingray can't connect with it. But that's not what these laws ever require. It's basic information. We want to acquire a device that allows us to track people using their phone. We are going to use it fairly throughout the city, or we're only going to use it in Southeast. Right, so it's that level of, and it's by design within the law. We provide enough information for people to have enough knowledge about concepts behind it and risks, but we're not releasing blueprints. We're not releasing kind of fine details, and so the balance is baked in there already. But people who want to defeat it want to kind of play that
but
up.
there's something to it, because there's the level of granularity about things like stingrays, where, okay, if you set your phone, and I don't think you can set your phone to defeat it, but there's also and organized crime and terrorists might know that, but then there's, your stick-up guy in South Baltimore who does not know that, and still seems not to know that the police can track a cell phone. And the more, there has been this emphasis from the FBI and others that the more we say we can track a cell phone, the more criminals on the margin will know to turn them off. I guess the other thing they could do is not take cell phones at gunpoint, which would be good. But
I don't think that's something that is not already known to people, right? The idea that a cell phone can be tracked is already pretty widely public information. The trade-off that you're talking about here, providing additional information that might tip off some criminal that they need to leave their phone at home when they go commit a crime, if they didn't already know that. The trade-off that you're talking about, though, is a trade-off where you find out information about how police may be using surveillance technology to abuse entire communities, right? And it's funny, this question about transparency and about cell site simulators, because it was actually Brad's FOIA'd surveillance log of the Baltimore Police Department's use of cell site simulators that yielded the data that served as the basis for the complaint that I filed on behalf of OTI and Color of Change and Center for Media Justice a couple years ago, relating to that city's use of cell site simulators. But what we found out based on that surveillance log, which provided what we found out about it were a bunch of really alarming things about use of cell site simulators in that city that resulted in some big policy changes. So one is that cell site simulators had been used in that city over 4,300 times between 2007 and April 2015. It had been used for all different kinds of crimes. It wasn't just like it was being used to track down individuals in the course of investigating serious crimes, but had been used just to locate witnesses, to investigate unarmed robberies. There was one case or one use that had a status note that said pizza box recovered, right? Very, very, a wide range of things. Not only that, but when we mapped out the addresses where cell site simulators had been used in Baltimore, and we laid that map over a map of the racial and ethnic breakdown of the city demographics based on US Census results, we saw very starkly what may be obvious to many folks in the room, which is that the devices are being used very disproportionately in Black neighborhoods in the city. We can talk about this more in a few minutes, but use of those devices also interferes with normal operation of the cell phone network. So it was mass surveillance tool being used in ways that potentially are abusive for something with such great surveillance power and insight. And primarily in Black neighborhoods. The trade-offs, you're asking a question fundamentally about trade-offs, and I'm not sure actually that the cost that you're describing of revealing that information is actually there, right? That we're empowering criminals by releasing this information. But I do think that the benefit to the public of knowing more about how those devices are being used, to what extent, in what areas, for what reasons, is very clear.
I think any trade-off, too, is about the context, right? And I think that when we think about the context, so quote-unquote crime is at absolute record lows. Maybe there's a slight uptick in property crime, but still record lows. You're more likely to be killed by a falling piece of furniture than in a terrorist attack. So I think when we're asking ourselves what the trade-offs are, I think that honestly we're not correctly balancing the dangers to the trade-offs. And we're constantly promoted, as Chad said, fear, 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 fear. But there's no major fear of someone inappropriately installing a flat screen TV on your wall, even though that's more likely to kill you than a terrorist attack. But then everything is completely militarized, everything is completely surveilled, all on the basis of really a fear as opposed to actual context. And I think that's actually super important when we think about trade-offs. I would say secondarily too, we found people who robbed people before there were cell phones or cameras. So there's also a question about that. But I think third, and really the direct corollary to that, is I think that we have to stop operating in the concept that we can create 100% safety without addressing the root causes of issue like crime. Like, for instance, If we don't want people to rob people for their expensive cell phones to sell them on the black market or use them or whatever, perhaps everyone should have a living wage and a roof over their head and a ability to support themselves so that no one feels the need to rob other people. But I think we get away from that with these silver bullet type of responses, which are, we can be 100% safe if you just give up a little bit of your constitutional rights. And I think that's a dangerous slippery slope.
And I think besides the civil liberties concerns, I mean, there's fiscal concerns as well. I mean, if you have, a lot of times companies will come to either city council or police department and show this shiny new technology and says it'll solve all your problems, when in reality, it may be like a slight tweak compared to whatever technology that they already currently have. And also, it would cause, divulge more information or collect more information. And also, there's, again, like besides just the cost of the equipment, I mean, there's maintenance, there's training, there's other added costs that are put on top of that type of technology. Now, does a city want to spend millions of dollars on this new technology that isn't going to make any drastic change, or do they want to invest that millions of dollars towards affordable housing or towards other things, other services that would benefit the community? And that's where you need that community weigh-in. You need to have the community to be able to voice their opinion about whether or not they do feel like this technology is important to acquire, and that's why having such ordinances in place is crucial.
The only other thing I would add just is, to the extent that the stick-up guy doesn't already know about the tracking of his cell phone, I'm not certain a city council hearing is going to be the thing that's going to, because they love to watch that public access TV. So I'm not certain that that's going to be the trigger that suddenly lets crime run wild because the city council is having a hearing on something. We'll see. Maybe they're very well, tuned into government operations.
So how then, I mean, say hypothetically, DC police want to acquire some technology that can determine in real time if you've been in a fist fight based on the movements of your phone or something. I have no idea whether that's a real thing, but you could do it, I guess. What would that process be under a CCOPS regime? What would the police have to do before they could adopt that technology?
Right. So what the police would have to do is they would have to go to the city council and they would say, we're interested in acquiring this technology. And again, the description you gave would be enough. They would not have to explain how it works, how it taps into your phone necessarily, but just, we want to surveil this. They would then have to provide reports, a use policy and a description of the technology that kind of explains, is it a mass surveillance device? Here are the potential risks to civil rights and civil liberties. Here's how we intend to use it. Here's how we wouldn't use it. Like, we wouldn't use it to identify people who are jogging, only fist fights. And they would provide kind of this base level information so that, and it would have to be released before the hearing. So it gets out to the community and they have an opportunity to digest it and organize around it if they want. And then they would say, we would like the approval for this technology for this purpose subject to these rules. And then the city council can either give a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or begin a negotiation. Like, we're fine with the fist fighting use, but not the jogging use. And so there's an opportunity for kind of a more full and complete discussion. And all of that would have to be done in advance. The other thing I would want to say, again, the model bill can change by local communities, and it should, right? Because if the local community thinks it should be done differently, it should. But one thing our model bill has is no grandfathering. So we're not saying whatever the situation is now is the okay status quo and we're looking forward. If a city is using surveillance technologies now, like Seattle was, and they're in the current process of reporting out on over 20 technologies they're using, you have to go in and go through this process and get approvals so that we have an opportunity to kind of reset on the issue and let the communities have a more kind of vital role from the ground up.
So how does that, I mean, when you're talking about sort of political accountability for this, right? I mean, notionally, we have a mayor, we have a city council. The city council is appropriating money in a lot of cases for these things. They have the opportunity to ask questions. There are elected representatives. What's the additional benefit? I mean, the benefit and cost are then on the side of a wider public discussion first, rather than trusting your representatives, right?
Right, so they're actually not approving the money for all these things. Sometimes they approve it into a general fund where it gets spent without their knowledge, but there's also other ways. There's private donations, there's grants, there's civil asset forfeiture funds, which when they grab it from criminals, they intentionally think, well, we're going to spend it here, so they can't track it. So I think that it's a little bit of a misconception that the city council is already involved in this process because they have the power of the purse. That's really not the case. And a lot of times in the communities where this has been either passed or discussed, you go to the city council members and they say, I had no idea that we were doing these things. And they're rightly offended by that.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and I think certainly that's an interesting reality. I mean, you certainly see it if you look at the budget here for the Metropolitan Police, that they'll have these like interesting breakdowns, like one, I forget the exact amount of money, but they're spending X millions of dollars on like special vehicles. Well, what is a special vehicle? I mean, that could be anything, really. I mean, it could be something that is, converted for people with wheelchairs to like a tank, and we're gonna spend $7 million or whatever it is on it, and we have no idea what it is, that I think even sometimes our elected representatives aren't empowered enough. But I also think like knowledge is power for the average everyday citizen. Doing a lot of community organizing, the number one thing people always ask you is, what can I do like right now? Like if I pick up the phone and call this council member, like what can I say and what can I do? And the more detailed breakdown you can give to people about this is what the government's doing, this is what it's costing, these are the people who have to approve X, Y, Z at each process, the easier it is to sort of break all that down into little bite-sized pieces. And then when people want to advocate, to be able to give them the tools to advocate more effectively, because instead of just generally calling or showing up or testifying in a broad sense or saying nothing or just voting and hoping for the best, you have the ability to say, you can call this person at this time to do this. And I think it makes it more effective both for organizers ourselves to be able to engage people, but I think also for people who are busy, limited time, limited resources, to find a way in and engage on an issue that they think is important.
In the case of San Jose, the police department had acquired, I think I'd mentioned this earlier, a drone. And this was just kind of mentioned in a line item, buried under, I guess, a long budget. And it wasn't, when this came out in the open, city council members were like, I had no clue that this was even the case. We had no clue that they were going to be acquiring this. And so then we had to begin this whole public discussion and cause a stink about it, because we're like, hey, the community was not informed about this. The council was not, really aware of this. And only afterwards did the public discussion happen. But with having CCOPs and these ordinances in place, it's going to happen before this even, is decided by the council, and that's what really needs to happen. But in terms of, we've already seen the surveillance ordinance in practice, like with Santa Clara County, shortly after the ordinance was adopted, and this is the first in the nation. They wanted to acquire some electronic helicopter mapping, some type of system. And it came before the board. We were able to have a public discussion. We had community members come in and say, hey, is it going to be used for this? Is it going to be used for that? I'm concerned about this. And they were able to answer questions. The Board of Supervisors were able to, kind of clarify some things, make some changes to the usage of it, and it passed. It didn't hinder the process. They were able to still acquire it. So anybody who says that, oh, this is not going to keep our community safe, this is going to prevent us from acquiring, this type of technology that's going to keep our community safe, it's not the case at all. And we've already been able to do so.
Right. So I'm curious, have you encountered examples of the police deceiving the elected government, or is it more a case of the city council not doing its job and asking questions?
Honestly, I think that, this is very DC specific. I don't know, people who know me know I think this. I think that a lot of council members are only educated on the things that they are on the committee of, oftentimes that they are the chair of, and everything else it's kind of like a go along to get along, and that's often what you'll hear from a council member. Well, what does X person think about it, or what does Y person think about it, and I'm going to make my decision based on what X or Y person is going to do, which, from a collegiality perspective, I recognize that you want to have some level of deference to people who are heading a committee that you're not a member of, or whatever it may be, but it's often sort of like, I don't even really need to know. If they think it's cool, I think it's fine. I think on policing issues, for sure, here in the District of Columbia, there's almost no oversight. And I think that is quite frankly, a function of desire, because I think there's a lot of trust in council members that the police always tell them the truth. But I think if you look at something like the NEAR Act, which we just put in very differently, it's broadly, for people who don't know, basically around addressing violence as a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue, relying on things that are not the police to address community violence. We've seen outright deception. We've seen, we are doing X, Y, and Z, and this is just like what's happening, and then we find out something else is totally different happening. There is an issue in there, and certainly I can plug this, the ACLU DC, Stop Police Terror Project, and Black Lives Matter DC. We sued the city over stop and frisk data, and they had been required by statute to release the stop and frisk data. They released, it's not fake, it's real data, but they released data that was not at all what they were supposed to release and claim that's what it was. So, I mean, I would say like mild deceptions, but I think you could even go further back. The Pershing Park case, which has deep civil liberties implications on the rights of protesters, where the MPD actually destroyed evidence. And that became a major issue in pushing new laws here around accountability around protest rights. So I've seen it on all sides. I've seen a lack of oversight, but I've definitely seen a desire on the part of the police to at least fudge the edges of what's really going on around a lot of issues, as opposed to just tell the truth.
I mean, I can give you two kind of examples that are kind of large and small. One in Anchorage, Alaska, where there was kind of a long-going knowledge by everyone that their police department didn't own a Stingray device. It turns out the police didn't want to completely lie about that fact, and so there was a public hearing discussing some very small matter of public safety. And if you watch it, halfway through the video, the guy's talking about public safety. Oh, by the way, we bought a Stingray. Moves on. Nobody caught it. Nobody caught it, and we were reviewing with the ACLU of Alaska to try to figure out whether they had one, and we came across the video, and they were like, oh, that Stingray. Right, there's that one, right, but other than that, we haven't. And a bigger example, which was unearthed by Bloomberg, was in Baltimore. Baltimore not doing really good on surveillance technology. They were operating a plane with a incredibly high-definition, wide-angle lens that actually gave them the ability to film the entire city and to be able to zoom into the point you couldn't necessarily see someone's face, but you could see someone walking out of their house into their car, follow their car around. Once Bloomberg unearthed it, the shouts of "I didn't know" came from everywhere. The community certainly didn't know. The elected officials were up in arms. And my favorite is, guess who said they didn't know about it? The police. Actually, the police union. And I said, really? You didn't know about your own program? And certainly, we can talk about, when we talk about not just the actual technologies, but how they're using it. They never say, even though, Laura and her group have found, that Baltimore, they weren't saying, oh yeah, not only do we own the ALPRs, but we're just focusing on the communities of color. And the NYPD is certainly not saying, oh, we're absolutely watching mosques. We're even going to Newark to do it. So there is a lot of, deception and actual misleading statements, but a lot of the deception, and where CCOPS really comes in, is just it's the lying and absence of statement. They just don't talk about what they're doing. And they use national security and these sort of things as excuses for doing a crime prevention, but that's the real problem. And that's the whole out of the darkness and into the light concept behind this. So there are actual examples of lying, to be certain, but the larger bucket is just not being forthcoming on what they're doing and the methods in which they're doing it.
Yeah, I was in this hearing in the Maryland State Legislature not too long after the Stingray complaint, and I did see a representative of a state law enforcement agency sit there in that legislative chamber and say, cell site simulators cell site simulators. We don't need to get a license to use them. It's like using I think he said it's like using a Wi-Fi connected baby monitor in your home. And he just made that statement in front of the legislature, and I was sitting there watching. I was like, are you kidding me? I can't believe he just said that. But but
baby
there's
monitors
this.
Have come a long way.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There was this relationship of trust that individual had with a number of members of the committee that enabled him to just make a statement like that and feel relatively confident that he would not be challenged directly as to its veracity. But on this issue of obfuscation as well, the obfuscation of use of surveillance technology, so it not only helps protect from a law enforcement perspective, perhaps not only helps protect their use of a surveillance technology from scrutiny the public and from the legislature, but also helps them to bring cases and prosecute cases more seamlessly with less challenge from the defense side. And that, that's something that we've run into as a problem in a number of jurisdictions, which is that a number of jurisdictions that have been using cell site simulators for years, it has not been clear to defense attorneys attempting to defend their clients that their client was in fact located using a cell site simulator. This forecloses a number of options for legal recourse that a defense attorney might take, including challenging the constitutionality of using such a device without a warrant. But there are ways that law enforcement may obfuscate use of the device in order to avoid that type of legal challenge that could result in establishment of a legal standard that is unfavorable to their ability to use it in the future. So they'll use euphemistic terms in some instances in their applications for orders or their applications for warrants. It's been through the work of reporters such as yourself and of groups that are advocating for public access to records, that sufficient information has come out in certain jurisdictions that for defense attorneys to find out that devices were used, that then allowed them to mount a legal challenge, and then that established or clarified what the constitutional standard was as it relates to those devices. So, in Baltimore, for example, I think it may have been your FOIA request that resulted in the information necessary to establish that a cell site simulator had been used in a case without a warrant, and that case went all the way up to the Maryland Supreme Court. The Maryland Supreme Court said you must have a warrant in order to use a cell site simulator, and a warrant standard was clarified in the state where previously the police agencies had been using cell site simulators without a warrant.
So that takes me to another obfuscation question, though, is like, and I hate to go back to Baltimore with this, but it is a pretty good example of, for a long time, everybody knew the police were able to track cell phones. Not everybody, not the stick-up guys. But nobody knew the specific circumstances in which they were used. And to a large extent, I think they still don't. How much does something like CCOPS go to the issue of, we possess this technology, but we're still not going to tell you it was used in this case versus that case, and it might never show up in the prosecution. So you don't get the ability to develop the sort of Fourth Amendment or other legal framework around it.
Right. So CCOPS requires reporting on kind of a larger aggregate level, not so large that it's meaningless, but deployments by census tract is one way that you can have to look at it. So you get a sense of whether they're using it in a disproportionate way. But very intentionally doesn't ask you to report it on a case-by-case basis, as that would really kind of get into the level of perhaps encumbering their ability to enforce the laws. But one of the things in CCOPS that I think is important, and again, it's in the model bill, whether it goes into individual state laws is up to the individual jurisdictions, but it bans non-disclosure agreements between the entity, the government obtaining it, and the private company. The private companies often want to work them in there. They say to protect their intellectual property, but that's not really the case. It's easier to roll them out when the public doesn't have a chance to kind of push back against them. So, will CCOPS address the problem of the police who are given the authority to use surveillance technologies violating their own rules and policies? No. Unfortunately, that will still be up to lawyers and courts and those processes. But it will tell advocates that they need to be looking. I do believe largely that police departments, again, most of their members seek to adhere to their policies. All evidence to the contrary, I guess, with respect to policing certain groups. But it will not solve the whole problem, for certain. But I think it moves us into a more protected space. Now, there may be certain technologies that are so nefarious that community elected officials say, we're just not comfortable with this being used. And that is certainly an option that's available.
Go back to my hypothetical shaking cell phone to detect fistfight, and DC adopts it and sets a rule, you can only use it to detect fistfights. And then there's a string of liquor store robberies or something, and just this one time, they use it for something else because it works, it's there, we've acquired the information. What's the remedy? What happens?
Well, in the laws, and again, it depends on the local jurisdiction, but in the laws, it actually can set up disciplinary standards, including significant fines and other penalties. Obviously, there's legal remedies. If someone uses something in court in a way that's a violation, the law actually states that you cannot use any data you find in any court or any hearing. It immediately gets thrown out, kind of a poisonous fruit of the tree remedy. And again, if they realize that there is a rash of liquor store robberies and this device might help, they can always go back to the city council and say, we would like permission for a new use. And if the public thinks that's valuable, then that can happen. But there are penalties in there. There are provisions that would prevent the data from being used in court. But again, it's not a perfect solution, but it prevents. I would say that it puts, in those cases, a series of speed bumps in the way as opposed to necessarily an impenetrable brick wall.
I think it also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just going to add that you want to make sure that there is that level of enforceability through either, the private right of action or, once attorney's fees being covered as well, if it is found that the ordinance has been violated.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think it also provides us a North Star to know who are our elected officials or people in high positions and what are they doing, and do we need to remove them, right? Just that one time, I think we all know that's the ultimate slippery slope argument. So if someone's going to be making that argument, maybe that's a statement about them as much as it is about an individual policy. And I think more and more this, I think especially for activists and organizers, is becoming a bigger issue because of the sort of legislative blanket that's being thrown over a lot of activities. For instance, you may or may not know this, so all pipelines are critical infrastructure now, right? So if you're critical infrastructure, that means that most of the national security anti-terrorism tools become fair game for you. I think we saw a lot of things with the Occupy movement and similar pieces in the context of the Black Identity Extremism document that came out from the Department of Justice, and what that actually means for Black Lives Matter and other younger Black activists, and what it means in terms of your quote-unquote threat assessment. I think that starts to create a lot of gray area around how these different things are going to be used. And so to me, the person who is going to say, well, we are only using it for fistfights, now we're going to use it for robberies, is also the person that if there's a bunch of peaceful, let's say disruptive protest, and the FBI comes to them, as they often do, and say, well, some of these groups are basically violent terroristic groups, they're also going to say, well, why don't we use this fistfight liquor store thing also on protest groups? So I think it also gives us a way to sort of suss out kind of who are our elected and empowered officials, and give us a sense of whether they're the people we want wielding that kind of power.
One more thing that is in the COPS law that is, it's a question that the police have to answer in the list. I believe it's there's an impact report and a use policy. I can't remember which one it's in. But what type of auditing and oversight are you going to have in place? Now, they can write none, in which case the city council can either say fine or no, we're not going to do it with that. But there are opportunities to engage even in a discussion and to put into place as auditing and oversight procedures. So maybe there is an external entity that gets to look over the records to make sure that they're not using it inappropriately. So again, adds it into the discussion, and so that it kind of fills out the system that way.
And one thing also to add is that one thing that is discussed with these ordinances is how is this information going to be used, and how is it going to be shared, or will it be shared? And especially, with the administration that we currently have, I think a lot of communities are very concerned with how that data is going to be shared with federal agencies, specifically with especially there are a lot of cities in California that are sanctuary cities, and if that information is found to go, trickle into a database like NCRIC that could be accessed by ICE, that would be indeed a violation of one's sanctuary status. Recently we had with BART, that's our transit authority, that there was a ALPR, that was collecting, think about tens of thousands of license plates, the information, and that was put into NCRIC, and that could potentially have been accessed by ICE. And so, thank goodness, shortly thereafter, we were able to now have a BART ordinance that just got passed this past week. And again, but it wasn't done. Actually, no, it took quite some time in order to get this passed, and it took the efforts of community members and community organizations that are on the ground, such as Oakland Privacy or Media Alliance or ACLU or EFF, that raise these concerns of how this information is acquired and who it could be potentially shared with. And that is something critical with these ordinances.
Yeah, and there's also, I should mention just quickly, that also within the COPSO, there is annual reporting. Like it's not that it's approved and then we're done. There's annual aggregate reporting of certain data points and certain information that's reported to the public. So the public itself has the ability to kind of keep an eye on things.
Yeah. So I have one more question, and then I think we'll open it up some. And that's why it's valuable to pursue this at a city level when, in a lot of cases, I mean, you can't then tell DC is an odd case in this for a lot of reasons, but you can't then tell the residents, okay, rest easy, you know the extent of surveillance in your community, because the tools can still be used by the state police, they can still be used by the FBI, the DEA, the Marshal Service, loves these things, and is really effective with them. Why? So what's the utility and trade-off in pursuing this as a local ordinance?
I mean, I would say a couple things. I think first and foremost, it's just a good way to start the conversation, right? I think that at the local level, which is a little bit more tangible, I think it may be easier to make move changes and to start these conversations. And then once you've said, X city is going to have X level of oversight over Y and Z types of surveillance technologies. Why doesn't the state government? Why doesn't the federal government? It gives you that sort of initial push. I think also, too, I'm just a big believer that if a problem is identified, anything you can do to lessen that problem is important. And I think definitely localized pieces. I mean, maybe another good example of this might be very different context, the minimum wage, right? There's a federal minimum wage and a state and local minimum wages. Obviously, I'm a person who thinks the federal minimum wage should go up, but like irrespective of that happening, like definitely let's do the $15 an hour, whatever we can do, wherever we can get it, however we can get it, because ultimately it's sort of the proliferation of those conversations that are going to sort of bubble up and create that national change. So I also think it helps us create the context to have a federal level discussion, which I think can be a little harder to sink your teeth into, because once you get to the federal level especially, and like national security, terrorism starts to become the watchword, I think that's harder for people. I think it just washes out a little bit more of the critical conversation you can have when it's a little bit more focused on policing, criminal justice matters, that I think people maybe feel a little bit more comfortable restricting the rights of the police because they have a little bit more of a sense, or at least potentially restricting them, of what that means as opposed to what the implications might be at a higher level.
So in the Bay Area, I mean, we have been able to pass it in the local level, and the county level. We've been trying to do it on the state level. We're having a bit of trouble with that, but we're working on that. But here's the other thing is that when you have the federal government who's been trying to utilize local police in order to carry out their work through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the JTTF, that is how you can use local ordinances in order to make an impact on federal, and federal issues as well. And I feel as though also with the federal government trying to give grants of military technology to local police, that's incredibly concerning, the fact that the militarization of our local police. And so having ordinances like this across numerous cities, you'd be able to ensure that federal reach would also be minimized through these type of ordinances and the sharing.
I think there are around 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the country. And that's so, the vast majority of those are not state or federal agencies, they're local agencies. And while there is a lot of really good work that can be done and that many organizations are working to do, and individual advocates at the state and federal level, the bulk of the work really does have to be done at a community level by community advocates and organizers, and those are the people that this type of structure aims to help by creating opportunities to engage, to learn more information about what's happening in their communities and to intervene.
Does this deal with the, if the city council says no Stingray for you, can I still call my friend at the Marshal Service and say, you guys Stingray him for me?
That would actually fall under data sharing, which is one thing that's controlled. So it's actually, we thought of that. So obviously, no local jurisdiction can control what the federal government can do in its borders. However, to go and say, we're going to bring in the FBI or the Marshal Service, you're going to do it for us and then give us the data, well, you would have to get approval for the sharing of Stingray data.
Not the data, the guy.
The,
You're going to give me the guy.
well, I mean, but then it would have to be, what would be the purpose of the local entity getting the guy when the local entity doesn't have the ability to prosecute the guy? Like, it's going to, if the federal government wants to run a prosecution on federal law in DC or anywhere else, they're going to go ahead and do that. But if we have prohibitions on the use of data, which is, again, that's the stuff, right? You get the guy, but if you can't use the data, you have no evidence, right? So hand you over the guy and his lawyer will have a motion to dismiss pretty quickly in front of you. So I think that's the best thing you can do with that. And by the way, there's not only limitations on the sharing the data, but also borrowing equipment. That's also something that's, we thought of that too.
All right, well, this has been very helpful to me. But if you guys have questions, do we have a microphone? We do have a microphone. So, anybody who's got questions, not speeches, come to the microphone.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, my question is about stingrays, and I appreciate the focus on local control of this meeting. But some of the material I've seen seems to suggest that networks of stingrays are being operated by other than duly constituted authority. Foreign governments, private parties. Senator Wyden did an inquiry into these things recently, and it just, from what I recall, the response from the agencies was pretty limpid and vague. We're not sure, we don't have the funding, and so forth. So is anything you've seen suggest that this equipment is being operated by spook or non-U.S. parties? I was also surprised to see that the FCC was never cited here. I covered the FCC as a trade journalist for many years, focusing on enforcement. The Commission has been locating illegal transmitters since World War II. They have a lot of expertise in this. They were never brought in to identify or interdict these devices. So we have no idea how many are there. And again, focus on local government, absolutely. I just wonder if you've seen some wider issue there.
I love this question. It's great for so many reasons. So the cell site simulators are able to they're able to latch onto your phone and to identify it and locate it by exploiting a vulnerability in the cell network, right? I mean, that is what they are doing. The fact that a fake cell phone tower is able to authenticate itself falsely with a phone as though it were part of the network, that's exploitation of a vulnerability that exists in the network that in theory could be corrected. And in theory, the Federal Communications Commission is the entity that ought to be responsible for ensuring that for protecting our cellular network from security threats like that by requiring that the phone companies essentially correct that vulnerability. So yes, that is a vulnerability that exists. To the extent that police agencies are able to exploit that vulnerability, so are other entities that are not police agencies that have the technical wherewithal to exploit the vulnerability. And that probably includes, almost certainly includes, actors of foreign governments. And maybe just other people too, troublemakers, people who are able to build these devices. We did file a complaint with the FCC in 2016 and and alleged that that use of cell site simulators by police agencies, by state and local police agencies, constituted an unlicensed use of licensed spectrum, right? So radio frequency bands that are licensed already exclusively to phone networks, and and furthermore that the FCC, by failing to protect the security and privacy of the phone network, was not only failing on its security obligations, but was failing as well on its obligations to ensure that our networks are available to all without discrimination on the basis of race, sex, et cetera. because these devices were being used so disproportionately in Black neighborhoods. The FCC is clearly aware of the problem, very aware, and has not done anything about it. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you about that. I'm with you all the way.
Hi, Sharon Bradford Franklin here with OTI at New America. So first of all, thank you all for a fabulous panel. My question is for Samina. Based on your experience getting these bills enacted in several jurisdictions in California, could you tell us, first of all, what were the biggest or most prominent arguments that were made against it by skeptics? And second, if you have any tips for us as the DC initiative starts out on the best arguments and strategies you used to push back and get the bills successfully enacted.
So for the first question, I think one of the pushbacks was that this was overly broad, that it was that it was just too many things would be covered. But at the same time, I think because technology is constantly changing, that's why this was drafted to be broad in order to capture all of it. Because right now we have certain technology, but we don't know what's going to be coming out 5 years, 10 years, or even 1 year from now, because technology, or tomorrow, because technology is always changing. And so that's why I think that that was one of the issues. Or one of the concerns that we brought up, but I think they quickly understood that that's why it was drafted that way. I think whatever we discussed earlier about, is it going to hinder the process of, or hinder the ability for law enforcement to acquire technology that's going to keep us safe? We were able to show that, hey, look, the process does work. They were able to acquire the technology that they wanted, but we just wanted that public process. I think that when law enforcement, or when one of the things that we do is that we actually do meet with chiefs of police prior to the hearings or the city council meetings to push this. Yeah, there might be some pushback in the beginning, but afterwards they come to realize that actually this is a pretty good thing for them to have put in place, because one, again, it creates there's already so much mistrust with law enforcement. So this is one extra step that can try to help with that. The other thing is I spoke to a police chief that said that I want something like this to be in place, because I want there to be some rules around how long am I going to be keeping this data for, this information for, because it's costly to be storing this type of data. And so he's like, yeah, I actually want something like this. And so when we have met with police chiefs, they actually end up becoming our advocates oftentimes for these ordinances. And I'm sorry, what was the second question again?
You put them together.
Okay, great.
It was the arguments and your responses.
There you go.
There's one other argument that I've come up against, which, and I don't mean it, is that this is very burdensome on police forces, filling out the reports and the answers. And so I would say two things. I'm not trying to belittle that response, but the first is, how much surveillance are you actually using that this would be a burden? And you get that in certain smaller jurisdictions. Like, oh my God, it fills out like, I get that they're doing this in Seattle, but we couldn't handle this. Really, do you have all the surveillance technology that Seattle has, like in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where we're doing one of these? But the other thing that I would say is, in a way, the response is, that's right. It is burdensome. And if you're going to use a technology that has the ability to go after some pretty core First and Fourth Amendment rights, yeah, maybe it should be a little burdensome before you roll it out. And if in fact it is easy, then it's probably not being done with the degree of care that is required. And again, I think one of the benefits that we're at now, having already passed this in 9 jurisdictions, is that they are 9 active jurisdictions that are doing this. So when we first started rolling this out, I'm sure you confirm this, saying that no one else is doing this, we couldn't possibly operate, but that's just not the case anymore. We have small jurisdictions, big cities, transit systems that are doing this. So the fact is, I love to say to New York City, who says, we could never possibly do this. Say, really? I thought New York could do anything Seattle or Oakland or Nashville could do. So I do think the burdensome comes out there, but I think that it's a little bit overstated, and that's kind of the point to some degree as well.
to put programs like this in place, to do it appropriately and with consultation involves getting groups that are sometimes demonizing each other and exaggerating about each other to enter into a public debate if you're going to pass local legislation. So I'm curious, short of having the 5 of you travel, around to every jurisdiction and give a talk like this that helps people kind of get a balanced sort of set of information, what's your advice to jurisdictions about how to have a public debate and a consultation process where there's a shared set of information that both, quote, sides, unquote, on any of these issues can share? Is that part of the CCOP's recommendations? And then also more about the burden point that Chad was just talking about. Part of that burden is sometimes law enforcement and local legislators or city councils. They don't have the capacity to hold a good public consultation for those same reasons. So I'm curious, methodologically, how do you make it a good public conversation?
I mean, I can start by saying, to the extent it's helpful, that the ACLU has affiliates in every single state, plus DC, plus Puerto Rico. If you're thinking about doing something locally, that's the first call that you may want to consider to make. Again, not that we are the starting point. We are decidedly not the starting point. The communities are the starting point. But if you need assistance, you want us to remind you what the website address is, provide you with some supporting documents, like we can participate in that. And we can help guide you in ways we've helped to guide other jurisdictions, or to tell you about other organizations. In the Bay Area, it's pretty. I don't want to say it's easy to pass these, but you guys, you're on a roll. So we're gonna step aside to other organizations, but you can always reach out to us, and we can try to help get you started.
I mean, and that's the thing, actually, on the ACLU website, I mean, they have the model ordinances in place. I mean, it's pretty much done. I mean, and actually, I like the fact that you have another model ordinance for to include militarization as well of local law enforcement, that we want to, have some language put in there as well. But again, each city is going to require different needs, and so that's why you can tailor the ordinance to what would benefit your particular city. And that's where you need organizations who are on the ground, who are working on these issues, such as in the Bay Area with Oakland Privacy, or of course EFF or CARE. I mean, we have a number of offices nationwide. But I mean, again, that's where it's the local power and the local community members that have to have that kind of buy-in. And that's where we also reach out to people who are, in colleges or universities as well, professors who would buy into this as well, and could come and speak to their support for something like this.
We have time for one more.
Thanks so much for a great panel. My name is Kevin Mira. I'm on the privacy team at Palantir. And my question is more of a general one about accountability and who we should hold accountable for this. And if you'll forgive a brief digression to Europe, I think about the law enforcement directive there a lot as kind of installing this data protection authority and data protection unit in the organizations themselves that's tasked with sort of these auditing and accountability things kind of on a weekly basis as opposed to the yearly annual report basis. And so my question is, I completely agree that we want more transparency in sort of installing these technologies in the first place, but my question's more, how do we actually ensure that on a week-to-week basis, we're not actually digressing from the data retention standards or audit standards that we set up in the first place?
I mean, I think that is why the conversation about auditing and oversight that has to be put in one of the policies is a very critical thing to function on. And again, this to me is the value of spreading this out to a community, right? Different members of the community are going to raise different points, and maybe this group is going to be focused on the racial justice implications, right? You are going to bring up the ongoing need for strict auditing and oversight, or else it's going to slip. But that is in there, and it has to be specific. Again, if the model bill is used, it has to be discussed each and every time. the answer to that, the deeper answer, is not one that I would be able to give, but that would have to be arrived at, which is what level of auditing and oversight needs to be there to perhaps not encumber the functioning of the police department, but at the same time provide real confidence amongst the elected officials and the public that these policies are being adhered to. And that, that's going to be an important discussion in pushing for CCOPS in general, but also every time a technology comes up, that's going to have to be part of the discussion under the law. So it's going to have to be, and hopefully over time there'll be a process where each time a new technology comes up, there's going to be a certain standard that comes in every single time, because it's going to be the standard that everyone is comfortable having.
I think that's a good point. I don't know if this speaks exactly to your point, but I think that one issue that you're raising, like the police department is part of the government, right? And I think that your question also is speaking very heavily to, are we behind the 8 ball, I think, as a lot of local governments in terms of data issues overall, data retention issues overall, security issues overall, and where's the sort of like whole government effort to really sort of focus on that? And I mean, to me, this is the starting point of a conversation about how do we actually do that? Because I think on many different levels, I mean, even we're asking the same question, because in my experience, most cities now are passing more and more bills requiring more and more agencies to keep more and more data in relatively vague ways, right? And so to a certain degree, I think we also have to look at how we're centralizing that capability in sort of a congressional budget office type of way, right? Where there's sort of like an entity that's more of dealing with it rather than just siloing it out to each individual agency as well, which I also think means that you're going to get less in terms of efficiencies, new ideas, and different ways to do things better. So I think that has to be confronted as we're sort of passing these laws and looking at these different things across a wide variety of agencies.
Well, that was helpful. To me, selfishly interested. So I think we have a couple closing remarks by Monica Hopkins from ACLU of DC.
So hi everyone, I'm Monica Hopkins. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of DC, and I want to thank the Open Technology Institute for hosting us here today, and all of our panel members for a great conversation. If we could just give them a round of applause. I also want to thank all of you who have joined us in this room and also live streaming. As the local affiliate of the ACLU, we have been concerned about this for quite some time, especially in the wake of the Prince Jones case, which we were part of, that discovered only through litigation that from 2002 to up to 2014, the Metropolitan Police Department had spent approximately $481,000 on Stingray technology, the majority of which was acquired from grants through the Department of Homeland Security. So we are looking forward to partnering with Open Technology Institute here locally and with all of you to explore local solutions to the proliferation of these technologies by our local law enforcement. And in the wake of sort of the last 18 months under the Trump administration, and I do think to this point about being behind the 8 ball, the more minds working on the ground and thinking big about these issues, the better off we will be. So I thank you for joining us, and we look forward to partnering with all of you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our moderator.